never told me what was right or what was wrong. Never taught me to play guitar, never taught me to write songs. One thing that she taught me I'll remember for all time, and that's that you should never walk across a picket line. I would never walk across a picket line. Solidarity forever, don't mean just sometimes. Long live the Union, cross my heart and hope to die. If I should ever walk
This afternoon we have our final panel. And then after this panel, we're also going to invite all of our speakers, so everyone who spoke here last night and today on stage, it might be squished, to have a conversation with each other. Before we start our panel, I'd actually like to invite Elle Jones, Halifax's Poet Laureate, to the stage once again to get us going with the panel.
Peace, everybody. I had a stressful yet soothing conversation with Randy this morning where we shared our mutual anxieties about poetry, which was like soothing because I'm not the only person that has to act this way before I do poems, but stressful because that's how I act. So the point is, it's hard to choose poems, but I'm going to do two, I guess. One's serious, one's not very serious, although about serious things. And the reason why it's stressful is because you're like, I know I'm going to get off stage and be like, oh, I should have done different poems. Don't let them take Mandela. No, don't let them steal Mandela. Make no mistake, they're going to fake, erase, and lie about Mandela. They can't wait for him to die so they can plasticize Mandela, appropriate Mandela. Don't you know they hate Mandela? We can't have the free Mandela, and they'll never let us know that we all can be Mandela. They won't let us feel Mandela. We can't have the real Mandela, just like Che Guevara shirts. They're going to buy and sell Mandela. Now that he cannot speak himself, they're going to corporatize Mandela, and we shouldn't be surprised when we don't recognize Mandela. And they will widen up Mandela, and they'll hide the truth about Mandela because the last thing they want to do is end apartheid like Mandela. So they'll divide and rule and govern through a colonized Mandela, and this capitalistic system will consume the true Mandela. And we won't like the new Mandela because he's not for me and you, and they will take him from the ghettos and the township and favela. Oh yeah, they're going to use Mandela. So we have to tell about Mandela. Don't forget the Freedom Charter when we yell about Mandela, but they cast a big umbrella full of brainwashing and error. It's got skeletons inside. They already tried to get Fidel, and they will stick to their vendetta because their clip goes on forever. They'll shove Obama down our throats while they hide speeches, songs, and letters. You can bet that they will twist him to whatever serves them better. They're going to write their own novella because they can't control Mandela. So we have to hold Mandela. Know the goals that drove Mandela. Spear of the nation, old Mandela, and truth and reconciliation sold Mandela, so we have to get to know Mandela. Not the diamond mines Mandela, or the compromise Mandela, not the World Cup or Invictus, or the canonized Mandela, the ride or die Mandela. Viva la Revolution, socialized Mandela. Cuida Carnevale and militarized Mandela. Castro and Mandela raising fists to the oppressor, oh, but they'll give us safe Mandela. Nobel Peace Prize, great Mandela. And let's forget about the state and institutions that brutalized Mandela and are still in place worldwide. Together they'll say he forgave, remember? So there's no need for the poor to ever rise up like Mandela. We'll get a quarter of Mandela, a watered-down Mandela, a kindergarten cartoon for your sons and daughters, just a shell of our Mandela, just like with Gandhi and with King, they'll sound the death knell for Mandela, and before his body's cold, they'll cast their spell upon Mandela. We'll get Have a Dream, Mandela, and Love Your Enemies, Mandela, and power to the people will be buried with Mandela. So we can't let them steal Mandela. Because they can't feel Mandela. It's the spirit of the revolution can't conceal Mandela. It's a 500-year connection sharing ideals with Mandela from the slave ships to Haiti, Cuba, and Soweto. That's what reveals Mandela. And that's why they can't keep Mandela. But we can't sleep on Mandela because the truth is there was never just one complete Mandela. It's the people made Mandela. The movement created Mandela. The youth in streets while he was still behind prison gates propelled it, and it went on. Whatever measures they they attempted to suppress it so that people can remember solidarity forever, because as long as our hearts beat, then they could never take Mandela. Shame on me for reading off my blood phone. It stripped on me, that's why I had a moment, and then you realize you can't look away, so that's what you get for using conflict mineral technology. Alright, this poem has a sing-along at the end. This is like a right old poem, but I'm going to do it because I'm being so serious. I'm not going to be serious right now. Sorry, it's dirty. Why can't people leave my pussy the fuck alone? Someone get Bush out of my bush, get Harper out of my carpet, and someone let these corporations know that my vagina is not a market. Stop trying to sell me douches and waxes and piercings and razors and customized washable battery powered pink vibrators. My vagina is not Fisher Price. It doesn't need toys. My vagina is not a chimney when it's Christmas for girls and boys, and stop with the jelly and edible panties and chocolate sauce and stuffing. My vagina is not a sandwich. It doesn't need toppings. Stop treating my pussy like it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. It doesn't have a sneeze guard. It doesn't need condiments. And no, my vagina does not care what color your condom is. And they're one size fits all, so stop acting like you need them custom made. And sell me the pill, but don't tell me my pussy needs to be controlled like birth control. There's a loose pussy in the neighborhood. Can somebody come pick it up? Birth control. We're not sure if this here pussy's been spayed and declawed, and my pussy doesn't need a little flap to go in the back door. That's such a dirty line, no one ever gets it. My pussy is not NASA like birth control. We have a problem. Looks like docking procedures might have failed on the landing, and no, my pussy is not going to blow up like Challenger, and it doesn't need to be a recluse like J.D. Salinger. My pussy is not Walmart. It doesn't need security cameras. And if my pussy bleeds a little, it's not gonna get damaged. So stop with the mini tampons, and tampons with a braided string, and tampons with their own time machine, and tampons with a visibility shield, and tampons in different colors like my pussy needs a rainbow, and is the pill like Baskin Robbins? Do we really need like 40 flavors? And fuck off with that douche shit, because my pussy does not have an odor, and even if they're both wrinkled, my pussy is not a puppet like Yoda. My pussy is not Michael Jordan's head. I don't have to shave it. Maybe my pussy wants to look like Angela Davis. And stop acting like getting waxed is an exotic vacation, like I just went to Brazil, but I think it was the rainy season. And no, my pussy does not need cosmetic surgery for any reason. So stop. For any reason. Don't tell me my labia are too long or too large or not the right shade of pink. My pussy is not ugly and my pussy don't stink. My pussy is not starring on Nip Tuck and it doesn't need to be sliced into before we fuck. My pussy is not a board you need papers to cross. Dicks are not illegal immigrants. No one needs to patrol my pussy to keep them off. My pussy is not an endangered species. It doesn't need to be protected. My pussy is not Afghanistan. No one needs to be elected. My pussy is not a democracy. I'm the dictator. Abortion is not the Death Star. My pussy is not Darth Vader. My pussy is not a foreign language. It doesn't need to be translated. How much slang for vagina do we need? My pussy is not a dictionary. My pussy is not Disneyland. It's not family friendly. But it is the happiest place on earth. My pussy is not a purse and you don't get to snatch it. My pussy is a snapper, but other pussies don't have to match it. So fuck off out my pussy with your scalpels and hatchets. My pussy is a private party and you don't get to crash it. My pussy is not politics. My pussy is not God. My pussy is not a model. My pussy is not religion. My pussy is not a business. And if you don't have a pussy, you don't get to make pussy decisions. Yeah. My box, my twat, my crotch, my snatch, my gash, beaver, bitter clam, tang, hamlet, camel toe, beef curtains, fish taco, queen minch, kuda, cooch, buff, poon hole, chocha, hoo-ha, punani, huriatsu, cock holster, furburger, bathing satin, squish and split whisker, my vagina, and my cunt. This is the single. Cause my pussy's nobody's pussy but mine. You run your own pussy, let me run mine.
Wow. Thanks, Al.
I think you need a moment of silence.
Yeah, moment of silence and let's just have fun. So, welcome everyone to our final afternoon here at the People's History Conference of Nova Scotia. My name is Ben Sechel. I'm a member of Solidarity Halifax. I'm also a history teacher, and let me tell you, after this weekend, I have my whole week's lesson plans laid out. So I'm very pleased and honored to be chairing this panel this afternoon. The common thread in this panel is specific sort of actions and movements that have taken place in Nova Scotia. We have Evan Cool, Tony Tracy, and Lynn Jones who are going to speak to us. And I was trying to think of another common thread maybe that united these people, and I think one that I found is that they're all very good at making you feel welcome and at home. Evan, after this conference is done, you should really angle for a dinner invitation at Evan's house sometime. He is an expert at making a feast out of what seems to be not very much at all. Tony, if you're traveling someplace, Tony will tell you exactly where to go. He'll give you guidebooks and perhaps even subway tickets. And Lynn, I met at a conference, I think it was about a year ago, and I was sort of sitting awkwardly by myself at the conference, perhaps like some of you are right now. And Lynn, I introduced myself to her on the recommendation of my friend Jackie, and Lynn took me in as though I was her long-lost child, and sat at the table with me and made me feel very much at home in that space. So, a little more about our speakers today. So Evan is going to be talking about radical Cape Breton. Evan is from Cape Breton. He's a socialist activist who has worked on labor, anti-poverty, and various equity campaigns. Also a member of Solidarity Halifax. Born from a coal mining family in Glace Bay, and has a long interest in labor and racial justice struggles on the island. Tony Tracy is a lifelong labor activist as well. As his bio says in your brochure, hyper-caffeinated at all hours of day and night. And I'm sure many other folks can attest, I've hardly ever seen Tony without a cup of coffee in his hand.
Hey, what's wrong?
He's throwing water now. Somebody please go get Tony a coffee. And Lynn Jones, a native of Truro, who has struggled against explicit racial segregation from a young age, and who has also been active against the Vietnam War, worked in solidarity with struggles for self-determination around the world, and fought for programs that gave Black and Indigenous people access to post-secondary education. She's also been a labor activist, being involved in the Public Service Alliance of Canada for quite a while, and was the first woman of color to be the Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. So please, a little round of applause for that. So we're going to go in chronological order, starting right at my immediate left and going down the line. Each panelist will have 20 minutes, at which I will try to keep them to, and I will inevitably fail. So, Evan.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I wanted to start off by saying that I'm a member of Solidarity Halifax. I've been an anti-capitalist as long as I can remember. I've read Lenin, I can quote the Communist Manifesto, but honestly, my first political education happened in my family and the networks around the miners' union in Glace Bay. And Ben mentioned that I can cook a feast out of seemingly anything. I wanted to particularly thank my grandfather for providing my earliest political education. It was my grandmother who taught me how to cook for 20 people using seemingly nothing, so I owe them both a lot. And to start there, where I grew up in Glace Bay, down the street, there's a monument to James Bryson McLaughlin. He was the Secretary-Treasurer of the United Mine Workers District 26, and I wanted to start with a quote that's on that monument. I believe in education for action. I believe in telling children the truth about the history of the world. It is not the history of kings and cabinets, but the history of the mass of workers, a thing that is not taught in any school. I think if you wanted to distill the People's History Conference into a couple of lines, that would be a good start. And I would also say that my earliest political education put that into action. From the time I was a kid, I heard about the general strikes in the 20s and how we burned down the company store, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit, but there's another part of radical Cape Breton history that is less talked about, and I wanted to start there. Glace Bay, my hometown, was home to one of the first race riots of the 20th century. The first one was in Shelburne, somewhere on the mainland, but in the early 20th century, at a community fair, there was a bike race where a fight broke out, and that eventually escalated to the point where there was a mass riot along racial lines between white and black. This was a defining moment in the racial history of Glace Bay and Cape Breton. The bourgeois press, the Sydney Post-Record, who was no friend to the miners either, but actually blamed the race riot on the proximity to the black community to downtown Glace Bay. The black community was permanently displaced from Maple Street to the Sterling, or not the Sterling, to the Hub, to areas on the outskirts of the town. It's one of the more shameful aspects of Cape Breton history, but it bears mentioning. In the aftermath of that, the black community in Cape Breton, which has a slightly different history than African Nova Scotians on the mainland, the Dominion Coal Company and all of its forms, DOSCO, BESCO, as part of a, in some instances, concerted effort to break union organizing and to foster divisions amongst the working class, would recruit workers from various places in the world with the understanding that they wouldn't be speaking the same language, they wouldn't be able to understand each other, the color of their skin would be used as a point of division. The coal company recruited extensively from the British Caribbean, and that's where, like, there's always been folks of African descent in Cape Breton since the time it was settled. Louisbourg was the major point of the French slave trade in North America, so that's important to remember. But in the aftermath of the race riot in Glace Bay, Marcus Garvey, who some of you might have heard of, he was a very inspirational leader in black politics. He started what we think of, I guess, as Pan-Africanism, and I'm not going to attempt to explain this too much because I probably won't do it justice, but he had a global reach and his ideas traveled all over the world, including to a little island off of Nova Scotia. We still have a functioning Garveyite institution in my hometown, the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Teresa Brewster, who is a community leader in Cape Breton, worked really hard to get that off the ground again. It was run down into the ground. It was about to be sold to pay for the taxes, and she and a group of folks in the community got together and got it back up and going, and that's where I learned a lot of this stuff. When you go in, there's some absolutely gorgeous paintings of like African Cape Breton miners walking down the Coal Town Road, dances at the UNIA Hall. More so than that, like the institutions that the Afro-Caribbean, the African Cape Breton community built, many of them still exist. St. Philip's African Orthodox Church is in Whitney Pier. For being from the British Caribbean, most of the miners and steelworkers of African descent were part of the Anglican Church originally, and the Anglican Church in the pier would not actually allow black folks to sit down on the pews. They had to stand in the back, and the community got together and formed a new church. It still stands. I work at the AIDS Coalition, and we hold the AIDS Vigil there in December every year, and it's always been a welcoming environment, and I learned a lot from the folks there. As well, like in the 20s and 30s, there was what were called the Black Cross nurses. There were the Melnick Hall. There was a Black Nationalist March in Whitney Pier. It's really a fascinating history. There's a book that was written by Joan Weeks about the history there, and it's worth reading. Really easy read too, and it has a lot of those articles from the Cape Breton Post or the Sydney Post Record about the race riot. If you want an excuse to vomit, like reading what was written is a good start. So I mentioned that because it's important, as proud as I am of the labor history in Cape Breton, it's important to contextualize that. And, no one there was perfect. They had blind spots, and hopefully we can learn from that going forward in our various struggles. So Cape Breton, 2 general strikes. When Besco, so when I say I learned a lot about capitalism from Cape Breton, a lot of what we're dealing with now in terms of corporate supremacy, the rich getting just like disgustingly wealthy off the backs of people living in misery. We had this. Cape Breton used to have the highest infant mortality rate in the Dominion, or in the British Commonwealth. Miners were paid by the ton of coal. There was no hourly wage. The coal company controlled the entire town. It owned the houses the miners lived in. It controlled the water, the stores, healthcare, everything. As an illustration of that, a story that my grandfather told me that was relayed to him by his father was before the UMW really came to prominence in Cape Breton. He remembered hearing that the whistle went off in the middle of the day, which meant there had been an accident. And within an hour, the company police, the company also maintained its own militia. It's important to know for later in the story. The company police came to the house across the street from where my great-grandfather lived, and they knew that because the only person employed with the mines in the family had been killed in that accident, they wouldn't be able to pay the rent anymore. What happened was they took the table and chairs out of the house and the clothing. That was the only things that miners typically owned. They slammed the door and nailed it shut, and because it was Christmas time, there was a wreath on the door. The company police officer picked up the wreath and threw it on the table and then walked off. I find that chilling even now, like I'm getting shaky thinking about that this happened. So this is the context that miners were organizing in. When Besco took over, this was like a sprawling, actually resembles a lot of what modern capitalism looks like. It was this sprawling amalgamated company of like sawmills and shipyards and coal mines and the steel plant. It was a behemoth. Their workers were getting paid poverty wages. The average miner had about 3 cents per meal. I mean, you can adjust for modern dollars, but talking about desperate conditions. The Provincial Workmen's Association, which was largely a company union, kind of had a role of complicity in this. They were anti-strike, they were anti-worker power. So when James Bryson McLaughlin came to Cape Breton, he'd already been blacklisted in the mines in Scotland for union organizing and for socialist politics. He really captured the imagination of a whole generation of workers. They went on strike in 22, I'm not a dates person, sorry. I think the first one was in 22, and that was over wages being cut by 1/3. And that was not a successful strike. It ended up getting crushed. Not all miners were members of the union. They kind of learned that lesson the second time and went for a 100% strike. And that was, hard to say unequivocally a success, but it was definitely a lot more interesting. There was this moment of like utter smug arrogance from the owner of the company when he said that this isn't going to last long. His exact quote was, "They won't stand the gaff." And and he was not so subtly referencing the fact that the company could starve and freeze the miners to death if they continued on strike. He cut off the company had cut off power and water to the town of Waterford, and in protest the miners gathered. There was a couple of thousand of them. They marched down to the power plant and tried to restore power and water. They got into a conflict with the company militia. William Davis, there's a holiday in Cape Breton on June 11th, Davis Day. William Davis was shot and killed by a member of the company police, and that's still celebrated to this day. It got really messy. The miners eventually went on to, I believe one of the entrances, one of the pit heads was blowing up, and like perhaps the ultimate symbol of oppression of the miners by the coal company, the company store, where people were usually in debt until they died, and usually far after, they burned most of them to the ground in one night, so go them. So this is what I grew up hearing about. It was really inspiring. It taught me about what capitalism is and how it can be fought. I'm not saying we should go burn things down, but maybe we should escalate a little bit. And I guess some of the lessons from this, yeah, I guess I'll get into some of the lessons that I've been thinking about this for months, so this is what I came up with. I'm not sure how profound it is, but getting back to the history of the African Cape Breton community, I think about what could have been different there, like if the white working class had been more conscious of racial justice and of the history of oppression and colonialism of African peoples, would things have been different? It also, for me, contextualizes what racism actually is, as both an individual and a structural thing. The coal company had a specific policy of ethnic segregation, so that's the basis of where a lot of communities are. Like in my hometown, for instance, it's all one town, but we'll say like, oh yeah, I'm from number 11, I'm from the Sterling, I'm from the Hub. These are all names of pit heads, like of the actual pits where miners worked, and community, like neighborhoods just popped up around that. If you were of Italian descent, you were sent to Dominion. If you were Polish or Ukrainian, you were sent to Whitney Pier. And if you were African Caribbean, you were sent to either the Sterling and Glace Bay or Whitney Pier. And those are, well, those general areas are still hubs of the Black community in Cape Breton now. So I think it's important to balance out both the actual structure of what we're dealing with and realizing that we're organizing conditions that are outside of our control, with thinking about what we can challenge and work on as individuals. The second thing, I'll borrow a phrase from a friend of mine. The second thing that I learned from this is that you can be for and against something. So with the union, there's some politics underneath all that I think bear a little bit of talking about. The United Mine Workers of America, it was an international union, and at the time of like this, I have 5 minutes, okay. At the time of this upsurge of militancy, the international president of the UMW is John Lewis, who is basically that stereotype about union bosses, just not really caring and being out of touch and living decadent lives. Like, that was John Lewis. He lived a very extravagant life while most of his members were living in poverty and getting shot down by company police. So this was, let's say, the UMW was a mixed force for both good and bad. And J.B. McLaughlin, like any conscious radical, knew that there was a little bit of maneuvering that had to be done. Like, you can't just reject that wholesale, even though like there can be a lot of bad things in the labor movement or student movement, whatever your movements are, but these are things we have to negotiate and kind of critically engage with, because even though, you know, this kind of conservative bureaucratic union structure was in place, it still provided a hub of radical activity in a community that desperately needed it. And I guess, like, just some personal thoughts to finish it off. The mines in Cape Breton closed down in 1997. I was 11 years old. I have to say, I moved here from Cape Breton a year ago. Trying not to be too pessimistic, but in terms of actually living in a place, Cape Breton is pretty bleak. It feels like a place without much hope. People continually leave every year. Those who stay still live in desperate poverty for the most part. And yeah, that's something that's kind of a bit troubling for me, but at the same time, like, I think about what political possibilities could exist even in a place that does feel kind of hopeless, and maybe that's where some people in the room are in their little segments of the city. So that's a sad note to leave on. Do you want to go back to burning down the company store? So yeah, let's just leave it there. I'll let Cody talk now.
Thanks very much, Evan. So from burning down the company store, and we're going to move a couple of decades in the future and across the Canso Causeway to the town of Canso and surrounding areas. And Tony's going to tell us about the Canso fishermen's strike, which happened in, I believe, 1970-71. Is that right?
That's right, 1970 and 71. Before I do, just to follow on Evan, and I'm really, really honored to sit on a panel with, you know, Evan, who's done tremendous work in articulating the history of Milton, history of Cape Breton, but also day-to-day work in fighting oppression and fighting, for rights of workers and others, tenants particularly across Nova Scotia, and Lynn Jones, who paved the way in the trade union movement in so many different ways. So I'm incredibly honored. When Evan was talking about some of the history of Cape Breton, the good, the bad, you talked about J.B. McLaughlin, and in order to get into my office, you have to walk by a poster of J.B. McLaughlin with the education, I believe in education for action quote. One of the things, not just that quote, but I borrowed something else from McLaughlin over the years. McLaughlin, when John L. Lewis finally died, and people can talk about whether it was a happy occasion or not, J.B. McLaughlin sent a telegram to United Mine Workers in the U.S. to indicate that he wasn't able to come to the funeral. He said in the telegram, "I apologize, I'm unable to attend, but I do highly approve of the occasion." I borrowed that, of course, most recently, when Maggie Thatcher died, I sent the same telegram, the same morning. As many of us felt the same. We have a complicated history in the labor movement in a number of ways. Silver Donald Cameron was first asked to do this talk today on the strike in Canso in 1970 and the struggles that continued throughout 1971. Silver Donald's book, The Education of Everett Richardson, is a must-read, certainly for trade union activists. It's a must-read for folks who want to get a sense of our history. And sadly, Silver Donald was unable to be here today. So someone had this incredible sense of humor. They're like, we're going to do the funniest thing we can do. We're going to take someone who is a pork chopper, a trade union bureaucrat, Tubby, they call me affectionately, and we're going to make him talk about a complete sellout by the Canadian Labour Congress and other unions. incredible sense of humor, and I really, really appreciate the humor of the organizing committee doing that. So on that, Evan took us through a lot of the history of Cape Breton. We're going to move off the island into Cancel. You talked particularly about the miners. I'm going to talk about the fishers. And we had at that time a tremendous challenge facing fisher folk throughout Nova Scotia. And of course our economy here throughout the maritime region has historically been fishing, mining, steel, forestry, where I come from. And we, of course, for many folks in the room today, don't have a living memory of those struggles or even of that work existing today. Sadly, I'm going to have to talk just about a year and a half period. I could talk a lot about struggles that happened later in Canso that I was actually not 4 years old during, where folks, when the fish plant in Canso closed, people came together, and even a mass rally that occurred in the late 80s in Canso. I recall being on. I was driven up in a bright red Lada, actually at the time, to this mass rally that was going on, where the Tory mayor of Canso stood on a podium, broke into tears, and called for workers' expropriation of the means of production. Tremendous stories. But I'm going to bring us back to 1970. The working conditions of fishers at that time were, it's hard to even explain. There wasn't a minimum wage, wasn't any kind of minimum price agreements. There wasn't any type of say or negotiation in the price of fish or the price or the length of the trips that fishers would go out on. When fish were weighed in the plant, the fishers weren't there to see the weight, right? So there were no way of actually adjusting, figuring out, were they actually getting paid for what they were bringing in. They're given no official statements of the weight of the catch or the prices paid for the fish. The price of the fish could drop at any time after the boat was unloaded. You go out, you fish, you come back to port, unload it, and then the prices drop. There weren't any agreements on anything, sanitary conditions, safety regulations, absolutely nothing. No minimum standards whatsoever. No job security. Fishers could easily find themselves blacklisted by bosses, and many were. And this was a constant threat hanging over the head of workers on the boats. Deep sea fishermen had no legal rights whatsoever to strike because they weren't considered to be employees. Under the Trade Union Act here in Nova Scotia at the time, they were considered to be co-adventurers, sharing the costs and profits of each voyage with the big sea fishing companies. The traditional division of profits was between 60 and 70% went to the boss, went to the boat owners, the companies, and somewhere between 30 and 40% were split amongst the crew, who also paid for their own expenses, the cost of their own food, everything that their own nets and other equipment they had to go. They in fact had to pay a rental fee to the companies to use the electronic equipment on the boats when they went out. So a trawlerman who was out in the boats steadily was paid somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 a year. That was on average the wage of trawlermen at the time. And that worked out to about $1 an hour at most, considering that most fishermen at the time would make about 27 trips out of various durations over the course of the year. They'd work about 5,000 hours in that period of time, which is about 3 times the number of hours that most folks go to work. So, somebody who goes to work 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, maybe takes a couple of weeks vacation, would work a third of the time of these workers who would make about $1 an hour for their work. In the context of this, blacklists, no rights under the Trade Union Act, no rights under any legislation. 235 trawlermen from the tiny ports, the tiny towns. Oh my God. Can I just say, there was water up here. My grandfather warned me against water. Do you know what a nail does when it goes into this? Like, it's dangerous stuff. Thanks, Judy. 235 trawlermen from tiny port towns, Canso and Mulgrave and Petit-de-Gras, came together and they fought for better pay, safer working conditions, job security, and most of all, the right to belong to a union they chose themselves. Seems straightforward. These workers organized with the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Unions, or UFAWU, and we're going to talk about shortly the history of that union and where it came from, and some of the extreme sellouts that occurred within the labor movement later. But I'd argue that all history, I think, is the history of struggle. The history of classes struggling against each other, the history of the oppressors and the exploiters against those who are exploited and oppressed. I think all history can be written in that way. And in this case, it's no different. And while this particular struggle is somewhat more complex, with some incredibly duplicitous, disgusting attacks from within the workers' movement itself, this is still a story of workers standing up to bosses. The bosses in this case. We're talking about two huge foreign-owned fishing companies. Acadia Fisheries, which was part of a group of about 61 British companies, directly from England, and a company called Booth Canadian Fisheries, which was a subsidiary of a Chicago-based outfit. Both had sales of a little over $1 billion a year. And of course, like any company that has sales over $1 billion a year, whether it's 1970 or today, that's on the backs of the workers who work. As well as Acadia Fisheries and Booth Canadian Fisheries, the fishermen also faced incredible opposition from what they called the cod aristocracy, the rich members of Nova Scotia's elite, as well as the politicians, the judges, the government bureaucrats, members of the clergy who stood up against them, the Chronicle Herald, the Cape Breton Post, and the Canadian labor establishment itself, the official labor movement. Silver Donald, in his book, says this is not a story of fishermen or even the labor movement. It's a story about privilege and poverty. It's a story about injustice in this country and about the social and political arrangements which cheat and oppress most Canadians, which stunt our humanity and distort our environment. And I think we can continue to think, things haven't changed that much in this past 42, 43 years. We still have those conditions that continue to stunt our humanity and distort our environment. 1967, United Allied Fishermen and Allied Workers Union, which is based in BC, began an organizing drive here in Nova Scotia, starting with workers in Canso and surrounding ports. And at the time, as we talked about, there was no job security, no say in the price of fish or division of profits, weights, anything. The union successfully signed up a majority of fishermen throughout the Canso Strait area. The fishing companies refused to deal with the union, refused to negotiate, refused to sit down at the table, and to use that argument within the Trade Union Act at the time. The fishermen were co-adventurers, not eligible to join unions. The president of the Canso local at the time, Edison Lumsden, said, "When you have no union, you stand alone. And when you're going in to fish, and when you're going in for fish prices or bait prices, trying to get your bait cut down a little bit and fish prices raised, going in there speaking alone, they're just laughing in your face." So workers came together and they formed a union. But the company wouldn't talk to them, not only because they said the act precluded them from forming a union, but also because of the nature of the union itself. It was a militant, union with a strong history of trade union militants, many of whom were members of the Communist Party. And the role of the Communist Party in Nova Scotia, throughout the period which Evan talked about, the period where I'm talking about, is incredible. And I think we could do a conference only on that. The union was led by Homer Stevens, who was a member of the Communist Party, who actually ran for the party in BC in the 1970s, in the Burnaby district in the 1970s. And the nature of the union, because it was a union that was perceived and had members who were communists in the leadership, was they were pushed out of the mainstream labor movement. The union itself had a history dating back to 1945. There's mergers of unions, as our histories of the trade union movement often involve. They represented fishers, shore workers, and workers in fish processing plants. Throughout BC, particularly, they sent organizers in the late 60s, 1967 and onwards, into Nova Scotia to work with these trawlermen, these 200 and some odd, 235 workers who themselves were beginning to try to form some form of workers' organization, and who the broader labor movement, the official labor movement at the time, had no interest in talking to, because they were precluded from joining under the Act. This union was at one time a part of the broader labor movement, the Trades and Labor Congress. They were expelled in 1953 for having suspected communists in the leadership, and they applied for admittance later into the Canadian Labour Congress in this period, were refused admittance. The UFAWU later joined CAW, which later formed with CEP to become Unifor, so that these workers later, but this was decades later, 1996, that the union actually came into the broader labor movement. The longtime president, Homer Stevens, as I said, was someone who was a proud member of the Communist Party, ran for the party provincially, and I think federally once in the Burnaby area. The strike of these workers, which began in May of 1970, closed 3 fish plants. The company had to lay off 800 shore workers because, of course, there's no fish coming in. The trawlermen, really? Wow. 5. Great. The trawlermen held fast despite incredible odds against them. After 2 months on the picket lines, so throughout May and June of 1970, the company won a court injunction prohibiting the fishermen from further picketing. The trawlermen refused to obey the injunction. On May 11th of 1970, the media finally catches on. There's a story here when scabs from Acadia Fisheries attempted to bring fish through the picket lines. Homer Stevens writes in his autobiography, which again, I didn't bring a copy here, but I encourage folks to read Homer's autobiography. Homer writes, "The strike was a vicious thing. At one point, Acadia Fisheries at Canso ran trucks through and into the picket line. Our members were arrested for obstructing those trucks over public mischief, over minor things. There was always something coming up. Emergency calls came day and night. We had set up a fishermen's council with 5 representatives from each of the 3 struck ports. On one occasion, we were meeting in Mulgrave when the phone rang and we got word that all hell was breaking loose in Canso. And what was going on? The police had sent in a tremendous force. Many of those cops were brought in from other parts of the country. They weren't locals, they were from away. And people were dragged down, dragged off to jail. The whole town of Canso was out at the time. With police repression, systemic picket line arrest by the RCMP, the cops from away, didn't break the strike. The bosses went to a judge for an ex parte injunction, an injunction where the workers weren't able to have a hearing in front of the judge. And the judge ordered essentially prohibiting all picketing. virtually prohibiting all picketing. 5 men were arrested immediately for continuing the picket line, and 10 days later, there was a judge that was appointed to a one-man provincial inquiry into the case. Other arrests pursued. I mean, I could go into a story about each of the arrests in turn, and folks should read this, and you know, there's tremendous history. But they were pulled in front of a judge, Judge Gordon Cowan, who demanded first off that they agreed that they're not going to picket anymore. They said screw off. They were sentenced to jail sentences at the time. Judge Cohen sentenced most of them at the time to 20 to 30 days in jail. Everett Richardson, who was a prominent figure in the struggle, and certainly in Silver Dawn's book, you know, he hears 20 days, and he's like, was that 20 days or 20 years? The judge, Richardson himself, becomes an incredibly important component of the struggle. The judge sentences him ultimately to 9 months for refusing to agree that he will not he will not continue to picket, and for some statements that he made to the media. At the point at which Richardson is sentenced to 9 months, the next day, 7,000 workers, including miners, construction crews, and industrial Cape Breton, walked off the job in protest. And after a few days, the strikers who had been jailed were released on bail. And it's incredible. 2,500 construction workers from the Canso area walked off the job. 3,000 miners went on strike in industrial Cape Breton. And this wasn't because their union leadership at the national level told them to. In fact, the union leadership at the national level told them exactly the opposite. Everett Richardson's name became a household name. His sentence, more than any other single thing, brought the fish strike to the center of the province's life. And it rapidly became a virtual general strike throughout the Strait area and into Cape Breton, without one ever actually being declared. The pulp mill, Canso Straits came to a standstill, heavy water plant in Port Hawkesbury stopped work. Miners in Cape Breton, as we talked about, they not only went on strike, but they sent carloads to the picket lines. Steel workers, with the exception of those that had to keep the burners, the furnaces going, walked out of the steel mill. Construction sites came to a complete standstill. It swept the whole region. It's really, you know, it's incredible to think about this. This was not led from the top, by any means. This was entirely led from the grassroots, from the rank and file. Steelworkers local in Cape Breton had just elected some new leaders. They had a pretty fresh outlook on what solidarity meant, and one that was much healthier than their predecessors. It was, you know, their workers and the local leadership in that region that stood up behind the strike. Not the national executive, certainly, of any of the unions. This wave of sympathy strikes, you know, really, you know, over 7,000 people coming out on sympathy strikes without their unions authorizing it, hasn't really been talked about, certainly nationally. We don't talk about it as much in Nova Scotia as we should. You know, and they were ready to push it to the rest of Nova Scotia. So this happened, and then Judge Cohen still had a handful of folks from Petit Gras still to sentence. Strangely, after 7,000 people came out, his ideas seemed to shift. He made an opening statement in the sentencing hearing 2 days later that he'd never been anti-labor, and he didn't want to jail anybody. Well, he did everything he could except to apologize. He released, in fact, the entire Petit de Gras group with no sentences whatsoever. Obviously, you know, it wasn't just Judge Cohen. A message had come down from above. There's no question. The provincial government didn't want to throw anybody into jail in that situation. It was too explosive. The danger was there was going to be a general strike throughout all of Nova Scotia if they jailed any other picketers. 2 days later, after the sentencing hearing at which he unsentenced, released the folks from Petit de Gras, he also released Everett Richardson, again, who had been sentenced for 9 months. He was in for about 10, 11 days. and others that he previously sentenced. Some of them spent about 10 days in jail, and they were released. Sadly, the strike continues, and I've only got seconds. After 7 months of starvation, police and court harassment, lack of support by the broader labor movement, the official labor movement, attacks by the clergy in churches every Sunday and other days of the week, the workers finally negotiated a temporary agreement ending the strike on October 31st, Halloween of 1970. The agreement included some increases in fish prices and some better working conditions. The trawlermen made it clear, though, that they would be free to return to the picket lines if they didn't have collective bargaining rights. And they set a deadline of April of 1971, that if the act hadn't changed and they didn't have the ability to legally form a union that was recognized by the employer, that they'd be back out in the lines. When the strike ended with a temporary agreement on October 31st, 1970, the Fishers had gained the right to decide the terms and conditions of employment to some degree, but their union's application for certification was dismissed. Despite a vote by the fishermen in favor of having the UFAWU as the representative union, the union of their own choice, the Labour Board denied the union the right to represent the fishermen. The fishing companies, Acadia, exploited a split, a divide in the labor movement between the more militant UFAWU and a union called the Canadian Food and Allied Workers, which was a junior partner of a Chicago-based union called the Amalgamated Butcher Workers and Meat Cutters. And we could talk, again, we could have a conference on the history of international unions and some of the challenges, throughout that period, some of the reasons why, unions like CAW later left their international unions. But in this case, the more moderate union had the support and backing of the Canadian Labour Congress and the broader labour movement. And the Liberal government of the day, which was newly elected in 1971, introduced provincial legislation granting them bargaining rights. But then the more moderate union, the CFAWU, negotiated an agreement, a sweetheart agreement, with the companies with no workers present in the room. Disgusting. It meant the sweetheart agreement undercut the strike. It undercut the demands of the strike. And it actually meant that unless fishermen joined the CFAWU and abandoned their union of choice, the UFAWU, they wouldn't be allowed to go back to work on the trawlers. So it was a closed shop agreement, negotiated with no workers in the room. And we've seen that happen a number of times over history. So after signing that backdoor agreement with Acadia and Booth Fisheries, the CFAWU proceeded to raid the union in Mulgrave, Canso, Petit de Gras. The fishermen were by and large unwilling to join the CFAWU. So the sweetheart agreement made it a requirement for them to go out onto the boats. And some trawlermen, reluctantly did sign union cards for the CFAWU, while others, such as Everett Richardson, the subject of Silver Donald's book to some degree, bought their own boats, returned to inshore fishing. The UFAWU would not become the union of choice. Absolutely. For these workers. Silver Donald says in his book, the fishermen were collective heroes and martyrs who lost the battle for themselves but won it for their brothers. And Silver Donald argues in the book that they smashed the archaic prohibition on fishers' unions. And he makes clear that in his view, and I agree with him, in spite of the strike's outcome and the sellout of the broader labor movement, that it actually was a victory for workers and organized labor in general, to smash the prohibitions on workers being able to join unions. And I'll just close with Silver Donald again, who said, thousands of Nova Scotians who had dismissed the labor movement as an outmoded idea 1971, and there's a few folks out there, I think, dismissing the labor movement as an outmoded idea today. But thousands of Nova Scotians would dismiss the labor movement as an outmoded idea, a preserve of thugs and opportunists, suddenly saw anew its fundamental glory, its insistence on respect for human labor, and its resistance to the moral squander of exploitation. If the strike was a failure, let us pray for more failures just like it.
Thank you so much, Tony, for that great story. And I can second Tony's recommendation of the book by Silver Dog and Cameron. Excuse me. And I can also note, what I find interesting is that book was written in 1973. And so it was very contemporary at the time. It speaks, I think, to the importance of documenting the kind of struggles we have as we have them, and not forgetting while we're engaging in them to keep what we have and to think about them and reflect upon them as well. So we're going to move to right here, to Gottingen Street, which is the site of the story that Lynn Jones is going to share with us. The story of the occupation of Gottingen Street happened in 1996. Is that right, Lynn?
We'll find out.
I'll find out. And I moved to Halifax for the first time in 1998 and had no idea at that time that this struggle had happened here. So I'm very excited to hear the story. Lynn Jones.
I hope people don't mind that I'm standing, but I find it very difficult to speak when I'm sitting, especially it has to do with size. We'll leave it at that. Can you take a moment just to stand up and take a stretch? And for those of you that do yoga, now's the time to do your sun salute. So just move the body around a little bit and, well, not that much. Okay, please be seated. Hopefully that loosens up things just a little bit before we get into the topic. Yes, it is quite traditional in the African community. We recognize the fact that we stand on the shoulders of those that came before us, as this conference is really good at. In doing that, it's not just a show. It's not just something that's in passing. Because often, before you have the authority to speak or the authority to give whatever it is that you've been doing, you need to ask your elders if you have permission to speak. So as it is the tradition in African community, I now would ask the elders that are with us today, if you consider yourself some of the elders of the group today, if you would rise, just stand, the elders, and I do request permission to speak and share the story of the Gottingen Street occupation. So with those elders who are in the room today, could you just give me permission, please?
I'm an elder, but I'm of the wrong color.
There's no color involved.
I think you want some from your community.
I asked for the elders in the
That's
room.
me.
Yeah. Is there any other elders? Thank you. Do I have permission to speak? Thank you. Thank you. Then I feel confident in moving forward. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers. This conference I was so much looking forward to, because I was to a solidarity conference at the church, the building, the church, some time ago, and everybody was just blown away by similar activities and sharing of stories and what have you. So I can't thank you enough for getting us all together and allowing us to share those stories. I also want to thank the organizing group for doing such a wonderful honoring of my brother Rocky, Bernie Rocky Jones. It was so And And I was thinking as I was hearing the stories of Rocky, that you might have laughed, especially people that didn't know him really intimately, you might have laughed with the idea that somehow or the other, that Rocky was this revolutionary who stood up for everybody's rights, that mentored people, encouraged people, and that somehow or the other, he didn't have some misgivings or downtimes of his own. And he did. I'm here to tell you that. But in that, if there's one thing that I learned that has always been in my heart and that I carry with me, was what he taught me, was that you act even if your voice shakes. So as you do your work, don't ever believe that your voice is not going to shake, because it is. And by voice shaking, I don't just mean the sound that you hear coming out of my mouth. It's some of the activities that the risks that you're taking along the way. So even if it shakes, keep on moving, keep on acting. I didn't have this to share with you, but as I heard my panelist here, I realized that, boy, there's another piece of it here in terms of my activism that fits in with the stories that have already been told. And even though it's supposed to come at the end, I'm too bad to just take it from the beginning. But one of those was my involvement in the trade union movement, which I was very active in the trade union movement, and I still have a love and still involved in my own way. But I just want to share with you, it mentioned that I was the first person of color in the Canadian Labour Congress executive, which is true. But I also was the first person of color who was a national vice president of one of the components within the Public Service Alliance of Canada, which was the Canada Employment and Immigration Union. And I love to tell, the story of my very first conference call within that union. And on that very first conference call, in fact, I had never been on a conference call, period, before in my life. So here I was on a national executive conference call in my front room in Halifax and talking to people across the country. And one of the people that was also a national vice president, he was trying to get an opportunity to speak. But the president of the union said, "Don't worry, I'll get back to you." Then he'd try again, but the topic wasn't, he wasn't on topic. He said, "Don't worry, we're going to deal with you." Well, he got frustrated. So in his frustration, he then got very agitated and said, "You haven't listened to me. What do you think I am, a nigger from the Atlantic?" And that was my first introduction to the national executive of the Canada Employment and Immigration Union. Now, you may say to yourself, well, she probably hates unions now and never wants to ever be involved again, but that's not true. Because at that time, I thought, okay. And of course, I had my rebuttal, and it took me a minute, because sometimes it takes us off guard really quickly. Anybody that's dealt with oppression and anti-racism and all these kinds of issues, it takes you a minute sometimes to get back on your feet. But believe you me, I got back on my feet. And part of that was to say that we're not finished with this issue. I'm not pleased you're not dealing with it, because the president and the rest of the executive did not, even though I kept coming back. And I said, I'll be back. But what I did, and this is critical, I think, in terms of the Canada Employment Center, what I did was I had to go back home and deal with, although I was physically home in my house, I had the group with my support group, which was other people of color, other activists who could understand what I might be going through. And what we did was we developed a strategy together. They weren't in the Canada Employment and Immigration Union, but they still knew the issues. And I had strength, and I knew that I was close to them. We'd done things together, and we developed a strategy for when I would go back to the next meeting. And I had a forum, my own forum at that meeting that I requested, and the president said, yes, you can have your own time at that meeting. And in that meeting, what we had strategized was that Dale big time. So all the things that we've been fighting for in the past, I had on my list of things that now I wanted because of what they said to me. And part of that was we were able to obtain the very first Human Rights Anti-Racism Committee in the Public Service Alliance of Canada. And there were so many other issues on that list at the time. So I just wanted to share with you that little piece of a story that was raised from the speakers before, because I then believe that in what we're going to talk about, the occupation of the Canada Employment Centre, it probably would not have been as successful as it was without the support of the trade union movement, including the Canada Employment and Immigration Union. So, just share that with you. Now, my task today is just supposedly to give you, it's hard for me to do, you need to understand this because it was quite a time, this occupation. But I'm supposed to be giving you the Reader's Digest version of the event that happened in Halifax for 122 days in 1996 that shaped the history of Halifax and the country as we know it. And of course that event was the people's occupation of the Goddigan Street Canada Employment Centre in Halifax. Now that occupation to date is the longest occupation of a federal government department in the history of Canada. History of Canada hasn't been broken. And it was accomplished by people like you and me, ordinary people who just saw an injustice and made a decision that they wanted to do something about it. They cared about their community, and they had reached the very end of their rope in terms of government cutbacks and total disenfranchisement, and who said, enough is enough. Now, 1996, anybody mathematicians, you could probably figure out that's about 17 years ago that this took place. So it'll be interesting in terms of this room to figure out where people were at the time. So, for those that will, anybody 22 years old or less, could you stand? Is there anybody in the room 22 years old or less? Okay. Don't be afraid. Well, that would mean you'd be approximately 5 years old or less when this took place. Anybody 30 years old, can you just, or less, any between 22 and 30? Woo! Well, you were about 13 years old or less when this took place. Now, we need to figure out how many of you were actually there. How many were at the Canada Employment and Immigration Commission occupation? So, you notice I didn't ask their age.
Smart.
I'm going to quickly name some names because I think it's important to have that roll call. I haven't got all the names, and don't even stand up and tell me, Lynn, you missed such and such and such and such and such and such. This is my memory cap here for a little bit of it. Lynn Jones, Shauna Paris, Rocky Jones, Kelly Dunphy, Debbie Jones, Marie Francis, Ann Betts, David Ade Kayorde, Katrina Lopes, GLBT community, Shelley Fashion, Lana, Mrs. Upshaw, Cup W, Fred, Crystal, Wendy, Eddie Carvery, Irving Carvery, Charlotte Hazel, Jerry Paris, Mark Moffat, Reverend Moria, Carrie Jones, Guysbro, June Mack, Betty Peterson, Peter Stauffer, Joan Jones, Ray Simmons, Gloria Uloff, North Preston, Alexa McDonough, Paul O'Hara, Yvonne Atwell, Melinda Day, Colleen Ashworth, Debbie Young, Kim Bernard, Rustum Southwell, Amy Moonshadow, Jackie Barkley, Jim Matthews, Judy Sparks, Janet McLean, Joan and Marcia, the Toronto Union, Brian Darrow, Paulette Saddleway, Jordan, Adrian, Jerry Clark, Jeremiah Sparks, International Socialists, Reverend Kelsey, Rick Clark, Gilbert Day, Anne-Marie Woods, Peter and Paula Jones, Wilma Jones, NSGEU, Shelley, Sherry. The list goes on. Anybody recognize some names? Now, as I said, the occupation took part in March 1996, when we learned that the Canada Employment Centre in Halifax, which was the last standing small Canada Employment Centre, because the government was slashing and cutting and saying that if you joined these offices together, it was better, bigger was better than small and community and that kind of thing. They were due to close on March 31st. Guess what date we occupied? March 29th. We just made it. March 29th was the official day of the occupation. Now, I could tell you that this was a well-planned event that was months or years in the making, but for sure I'd be lying. What I can tell you was that the stage was set for this to occur, and most of us didn't even know that the stage was set because it just happened. What was the political climate at the time? In Halifax, nationally, internationally, the famous G7 summit had just occurred the year before, when all the famous countries were here in Halifax organizing how they were going to partition up the world for themselves. But the left in Halifax had organized their own alternative summit known as the People's Summit. Anybody around for the People's Summit? Of which, Rocky was part of. Okay, no problem.
Let the woman speak.
What is
our t-shirt from the beginning.
Yeah, I have a t-shirt too. Okay. So the left wing was building. They were really coming together, and we even had a group. It was called Rent a Demo. We ended up naming ourselves because all the different communities we joined together constantly. And before all this took place, we were constantly protesting. I mean, somebody just raised their hand. Okay, protest over here. Come on over. And we ended up calling ourselves Rent a Demo, of which unions and communities were involved with. But let me jump to the bar on Brunswick Street. There was a group of trade unionists that met regularly on Fridays. And then other people ended up joining too, to have, right one. And when we met, we still discussed the social issues of the day. But people were mad about the occupation of Gaudigan's, the removal of the employment office. So we were strategizing, well, what can we do about that? What can we do about that? And I can honestly say that the person that came up with the idea was Evelyn Riggs, who is now Peter Stouffer's and the NDP, his assistant. Everyone said, let's occupy. And we said, occupy? Yeah, it shouldn't take long. We'll just all move in. So our task was, each of us were tasked with going back to our individual communities, whether it be black, trade union, or whatever, and kind of seeing what's the climate like. It was all secret, and I can honestly say that the secret never got out. And they went back to their communities and said, listen, can you mobilize a few people going down for a sit-in? We should be there a couple of days, and it'll be all over. Caroline remembers that. Because I remember meeting up in our office upstairs after, can black community do it? Can we do it? Yeah, everybody said, okay, we're in. So that was it. Within a day or two, I don't even think it was 2 days. We said, okay, we'll go down to the office and we'll occupy. Well, our plan didn't work too well, what we had planned, because the manager of the office, and I might say too, this was the office I worked in. It's good to mention that. They're outside, so we go down and we're ready to bust in the office, but they're already inside, so there goes our plan. Thank God, one of the workers, who was Dewana, ended up coming in late that day because of something to do with their children. She came with the children. She was supportive. So when she used her key to open the door, Sister Shelley Fashion said, oh, busted through the door! And then that's how we got into the office. Well, once we got in, it became an occupation like no other. We turned that Canada Employment Center into a place for the whole community to gather. And in that community, I wish I had time to go over the list of events that, which I made a list of them. We had demonstrations, we had meetings every day at 5 o'clock that the whole community was invited to strategy meetings. We had rotating chairs that each day chaired the meeting where we would strategize what activities we had. We had the press on our side throughout. The media was amazing. They couldn't believe there was these group of people and they could talk to anybody. They didn't have to have one person they could talk to. They could talk to everybody. We had Easter donkey walk. The churches came up on Easter, and we had religion and social justice event at the Canada Employment Center where the religious leaders came and talked about what their role would be or how they should be involved. Artworks had the most amazing parade of using their artistic talents to advertise the fact that the center and the community needed to be open. We had our own budget where we had an alternative budget press conference about how the government money should be spent. We attacked at the national community. Bob White from the Canadian Labour Congress came down and we had a massive trade union rally and what have you out on the down by City Hall. We ended up at City Hall being supported by the mayor. I wish I had time to just tell you all those events and ways that Canada Employment went. But what I want to jump to is, from the activities, is at least, because we're at the end, to talk about was that occupation successful or was it not successful? Or you may say, Lynn, what happened in the end? And you can ask later about some more of the things that we did. So I kind of plugged out, how come we lasted for 133 days? What were the factors that contributed to that? So some of them that I felt was, I don't know if people remember, it was the support of the owner of the building, Edith. One of them was the fact that although Edith wasn't involved in these social justice issues, she made sure that we were not kicked out of that building. It was her building and she didn't care who came along. We had a right to be there, and that therefore, as a part of that, she would support us. And I don't know who paid the rent for those 133 days, but we were there. We had the support of the trade union movement across the board, but in particular, although it is my union, I can say, in particular, the PSAC. The PSAC put an incredible amount of resources, including people resources and financial resources, into keeping that occupation going over that period of time. The end of the day connections. At the end of the day, everybody went for coffee, a beer, whatever, often, and just said, okay, whoo, another day, we made it another day, and away we go. The enthusiasm kept us going. We did things constantly to keep people enthused about what happened. A clear political agenda. It wasn't convoluted and complicated. Everybody knew from the street to inside why we were there and why it was important. The word of mouth. Word of mouth was important. We didn't have all these electronic things. So we figured out ways to send forward the word of mouth. Were there challenges? Yeah, there were challenges. And as a matter of fact, there would be some disagreement, even probably with people in this room, what some of the challenges would be. We'll leave it. Some of those challenges, but one of them for sure was keeping people engaged and on objective. What happened in the end? Some of you know. By the way, that Godigan Street office, the space is still just up the street here, only a couple of 1 block away, I think. That's at the end. Well, at the end, the government couldn't take it anymore because it made national news. There was hardly a day it wasn't in the paper, and all supportive of the people that were occupying. I don't think we had any bad press at all. And something had to be done. So a clandestine meeting, which not everybody even knew what, was organized because the head of Canada Employment and Immigration Union was, it was important for them to connect with the union in the workplace, which was the PSAC at that time, and that was one of the representatives. And they had a meeting, and they said, listen, it's got to stop, we can't take it. What can we do? I've been charged from Ottawa that this has got to stop. So in the end, it was agreed that, the only thing you got here is the office has got to stay open. So she said, and you've got to meet with the people. You didn't do it before, and I'm not here to be the in-between from the community, between the communities. So whether you like it or not, you're gonna have to face something. So that meeting was held, I believe Carol Ann Wright was at the back of the room, Rocky Jones, and I don't know who all was at that meeting, but Joanne Taze was the name at the time. And it was agreed that, yes, the office would stay open. There would be a press conference where all this announced. One of the problems was the staff person who happened to be me. So I got a 6 o'clock in the morning phone call that said, Lynn, we're going to sign, but we don't want you there because you're staff and it's not going to look pretty. And I remember making a decision. Look, I've been here for 133 days. If I go, I go. Anybody who knows the Bible, if I perish, I perish. But no, I can't do that. I got to be there. So at that point, I remember it was the first time in my life I was prepared to say, no job, but this means enough to me. But I also knew that I had done enough work in the community and with the community that they wouldn't hang me out. They wouldn't leave me with no job or out there to die. So I knew there was support that was there. So the agreement was made, and as I felt, the community said, she's not there, we're not signing. So that was the deal. So the deal was signed, and the event was held at the North Branch Library, and the office remained open. But somebody stated earlier, the story is not over, because the office did stay open. We won that battle. So let's give a hand for that battle. Later on, we dispersed. The workers dispersed, the community dispersed, things became a bit complacent, no more protests hardly, all of this. And the government slowly developed their own plan. And first of all, what they did, they moved the workers up to the Y. So they closed the door and said, no, we're not closing the office, we're just moving the workers up to the street, to the YMCA. After they moved the workers from the YMCA, then next thing we know, there was no outcry. Next thing we know, those same workers were moved to the Halifax Shopping Center in the area that required the most employment services in this city, the north end of Halifax, no longer had a Canada Employment Center. So I'll leave it at that because I know there's questions and answers and my time's up. So I thank you for allowing me to share that little bit of history on behalf of all the people who struggled at the Canada Employment Center.
Thank you so much for that story, Lynn. We are slightly over time, but maybe we can take one or two questions if anyone has a really burning question. The next thing we're going to move right into is having all the rest of the speakers who've spoken at our conference to come up on the stage together. But if anyone has a burning question about something that was spoken here, then we can take that.
I have a question. It's just about what you just said, Lynn. What do you think could have been done to keep that kind of clandestine, sneaky thing that the government did from happening? Was there anything that the community could have done in terms of continuing the protest, in terms of keeping the issue in the forefront of the public eyes and minds? I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Is this one? I thought about that on so many different occasions, but the people that were involved in the protest, little did the government know, but we were going to end it before. It just happened all at the same time. We said we had enough of this. We were tired. And we said it's going to end. It just happened that the government must have got tired at the same time and moved in. But I think had there been different, it's kind of like different people doing different jobs. Like there could have been the people that did the sit-in and they sat in. And then there could have been another strategy group outside. Or you just needed more hands and more people doing different things to keep it going. But it wasn't that people didn't care anymore, because they did care anymore, or that people, they knew what was happening. They knew and they said, isn't that sad? Like, look at what we did, all the time we spent, and look what's happened. But I don't know, some other people may have some other ideas about how that could have kept going.
Thank you. I see a question at the back, and we'll make that the last question.
It's not a question, it's a point of information. I am Ron Carson's, Ann Carson's daughter, and he was the minister in Canso at the time when the strike was on. And I'll tell you that I hear a lot about what the men did at the strike and stuff. But let me tell you that the women in that community held those men together. And the women in that community... Like my father would take me whenever he went to visit someone, and we'd go together. I'd be in the yard, come on, Miriam, let's go. He always took a kid with him whenever he went somewhere. And the desperation of those women's faces, and my mother, making sandwiches every day, trying to, all the women getting together, trying to make the food stretch so that at least the kids ate. Sometimes the adults didn't eat, but the kids had to eat. And all that kind of solidarity that went on at that time. And if you look at the strike through a child's eyes, and I was 9 years old at the time, it was a very different strike. You had a friend, and then all of a sudden, if this was the daughter of the people in management, the rich people, and then all of a sudden you couldn't be around her anymore because her parents wouldn't let you play with her. Okay? I can name you every single teacher I had since primary up to grade 12, except for grade 2. Because I literally cannot remember anything about my schooling or my teacher or anything. There was a hit out on my father. They threatened to burn us down. We had guards around the house 24 hours a day.
Oh.
Right? And so from a child's perspective, that is, and the women's perspective, it was a real crisis. I just want to put that out there.
Thank you so much for that comment. And from there, we're going to invite the rest of our speakers who have been here over the course of the weekend. So I'm not sure if absolutely everyone's here, but Caroline Wright Parks, George Elliott Clark, and Jacqueline Lawrence from last night. And from this morning, Chris Fraser, Sherry Pictou, and Pat Kippen. If you'd like to come back up. But before you, I forgot I have some tokens of our appreciation as well. Tony's already left to get some more coffee. But Tony, I have a gift for you here that I'll bring to you over at the coffee table. Evan, thank you so much. And Lynn, thank you so much. And these gifts I'd like to mention are courtesy of Fernwood Publishing. Thank you so much to Fernwood for supporting us in this commitment.
Lynn, I should have warned you on the Victorians kind of theme.
Give it back. You got it, you. Do I go?
Yes, that's all right. Thanks a lot.
Check. Check 1, 2. Okay. Check.
We'd also like to invite Elle Jones to the front if she's still here. She made such a contribution. Elle, are you here? So we have almost everybody, with the exception of George. I'd like to introduce Omri Haven, who is a member of Solidarity Halifax on the committee. And he's going to do this final exchange between all of our wonderful speakers. Omri.
Hey, so my name's Omri. I'm a member of Solidarity Halifax, and I helped to plan this conference. And I just wanted to thank everyone for staying up to this point. It's wonderful to see so many faces, and so many new faces as well. I just wanted to actually start this panel with a little anecdote. Last night, after the speeches that were given, and just in the thrall of being surrounded by so many amazing people, being surrounded by the People's Museum, hearing these incredible stories, I wrote to the panelists about this panel that we're on right now. And I said, I sort of gushed about all those incredible things. And I just want to briefly read an email response that I got from Lynn Jones, just in the wake of that. Get some sleep. Thanks, and good night. So, in the spirit of that brevity, I'm gonna try and introduce this panel as best I can. But actually before that, I'm gonna run through the names of all the people who have spoken, because I think it's really important. We're gonna take away from this conference a bunch of anecdotes, a bunch of stories, but I think the names of these people are the names of people who are at the forefront of the movements in this province. And so I'm going to run through the names, and I'm going to ask you to wait to applaud until the end, just because we're trying to be brief. Lynn Jones, Tony Tracy, Sherry Pictou, Evan Cool, Chris Fraser, Caroline Wright Parks, Pat Kipping, George Elliott Clark, Darlene Lawrence, Elle Jones. So this final panel is about giving our speakers the opportunity to talk with one another, to raise some issues that came up during the conference, to compliment one another, and possibly pick fights with one another. We'll just see how things go. The challenge of the conference, as well as I'd say Solidarity Halifax in general, is to look at both our individual movements, but as well as broader movements, and to look at how we can incorporate all of our struggles together and look towards a unifying sort of a theme or a unifying purpose in some ways. And so with that in mind, we're asking the panelists the question, was there anything you heard from fellow presenters that had a particular resonance for you that you might take forward into the future? And just to put the caveat, we share these stories not just because they're enjoyable to hear, but because we're hoping to take action in the future. And so I would love to hear from folks. I don't know if we want to just go in a straight line. That might be easier. In that case, either Pat or Elle get the wonderful opportunity of speaking first. Otherwise, whoever feels they can speak to this first can see what's on their mind. Anyone? I also have a bunch of questions lined up. So you're not getting out of this.
It's kind of a question and a comment. One of the unifying themes I heard on our panel from Chris and Sherry, and then from Elle, and certainly from Evan, definitely from Lynn, was this idea and these individual acts and collective acts of resisting the box, resisting, in Chris's case, he resisted the cage, the prison to be the empress in. Elle asked us to resist the media legacy portrayal of Nelson Mandela. Lynn refused to follow the dictates of her union and meet in private. And Sherry really drew our attention to that whole area. That's where, when I realized this was, kind of rejecting the silos and thinking out of the silos and crossing over and changing our way of thinking about one another. So those individual acts that cause us to challenge the society's assumptions and our own assumptions about other people or ourselves are really, really important. And along with that is the whole idea of identity and definition. And Kathleen Shannon, who was the executive producer and the founder of the National Film Board Studio D, the women's studio, once said in a meeting that I attended that true oppression was letting someone else define you. And I think what I saw here, and if anyone else wants to speak to that, is the importance of making our own definitions and defining ourselves and not letting anyone do that. My father, who I love dearly but is a conservative, I don't know where I went wrong with him, but he called me a goddamn socialist at one point when we were having an argument. I said, "Oh no, Dad, I'm not a goddamn socialist. I'm a radical feminist dedicated to overthrowing the patriarchy." Oh yeah, that's a lot scarier.
I am a goddamn socialist. And with that in mind, while we're sharing reflections, one thing that I took from all of our stories, whether we were talking about stuff that we'd been involved with or stuff that we've heard about that were part of our histories in another way, was that all this stuff sounds really impressive, and it is. We're talking about just like these really important moments in our collective history, and they should keep happening. Like, just because this stuff is in the past doesn't mean it can't happen again. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need to happen again. If anything, I would say as much as in the 20s, as much as in the 70s, as much as in the 90s, now we need to start resisting, and we need to start doing it together. Everyone on the stage, like we might be smart, and our names might be in the bill, but there's nothing particularly remarkable in a lot of ways. Like, we're just normal people. It's just up to normal people, not, our politicians, not even, national labor leaders. It's people in the neighborhoods, people on Gottingen Street, people in Dartmouth, people on the campuses who are going to make a difference. So, I don't know, after this panel, maybe we can just start mingling and talk about what kind of trouble we can cause.
Well, there's a lot I could say, but I won't. Just a couple of things. One is that I love the fact that there are so many young faces in this audience. I became a commie when I was about 20 or 21, and I haven't looked back since. I had some ballast, and that came from the stories of my parents and grandparents. And actually, all the stuff talked about Canso especially brought back a lot, because my grandparents and my parents also grew up in a company town. So I got the ballast, I also got the fire in my belly. And they left that with me, whether they really realized what they were doing or not. And so now I'm an educator, and I'm getting I'm on the downward slope. But it's a long slope. Well, that's right, I'm gonna hurry up, and just for you. I remember being asked when I was about 20 or 21, do you really think that you're ever going to see revolution? And my answer then was yes. And if you ask me the same question now, the answer is yes. So you guys better hurry up and get The biggest lie that gets sold today is that there is no alternative. And for me, if there's no alternative, it's a bad place to be in. I grew up in that bad place, and I've been fighting against it, pushing everywhere that I can to find a way forward. And I can't say that I've always succeeded, but you keep pushing and you will make your breakthrough. And young people, I get tired of hearing, and I hear this all the time too, at the place where I teach, or I read it in the media, and it's complaining about the apathy of young people. I don't believe it. I do not believe it one little bit. We got a job to do, and that's to teach and to give young people the tools that they can make the world that they want to live in. And never mind what the older folks say, right? We may criticize the way you do it, whatever, but do it. Just do it, because we had to deal with all that shit too. And they were wrong 40 years ago, and we'd be wrong to put it on you again, and we have got your backs.
I was struck throughout the course of last night and this morning and with my co-panelists it's incredibly important that we tell stories, and we've all got stories to tell. But it's also incredibly important, and I was really struck by hearing how people's ideas shift when they're in struggle together. That collectively working together allows us to change ideas in a way that we don't get from any course, that we don't get from any book, that we don't get anywhere else, except by coming together. And, I wasn't alive I was 4 years old during the cancel strike that I spoke about earlier, but, I too grew up in a company town, not here in Nova Scotia, but in New Brunswick, a small pulp mill town. And I remember, being really inspired in '84 when miners in Britain went on strike. Miners in Britain go on strike, and you can actually see a consciousness shift. Much like the town I grew up in, I went to work in the pulp mill when I was 17, and I worked in the mill for some time before deciding to go off to university and so forth. But much like the town I grew up in, miners weren't necessarily known to be the most progressive, supportive bunch of folk. And much like the experience the sister spoke to in Canso, in her childhood that she actually lived through, in that memory of that, where women came together and actually were the backbone, really, and the story that I didn't tell within the course of the cancel strike. In Britain, same thing. You know, and people's ideas shift even with that, right? When the people who were bringing in the income and so forth, when they're now on a picket line, they're without income, they've got none, and someone else is having to go to work, someone else is having to make those kind of economic decisions for the family, and it shifts people's ideas, right? Like people change in the course of struggle. Like some of that shift, some of that it can be tough. But just one other story, just to kind of try.
Well, we're running short on time, and we're trying to get everyone involved. And so,
sorry,
what I'm wondering actually,
I'll have to leave out the
you might need
the
to
gay liberation movement support for the
yeah. I can. I have another question just to sort of add on, and if folks want to answer the last one, I'm looking also for the moments in your life where things switched. Sherry talked about that a bit in your speech, and I'm very interested in that as someone who's a young person, but also as a group of people here who are looking to help other people sort of raise their consciousness and fully participate in things.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the power of conversation. That has been the most important thing in my life. It's just having conversations with people about things that need to happen. And as much as the event or the rally or the occupation were really important parts of that, I have always remembered the first conversation. How did we get here? That's more dangerous than sometimes the event is the original conversation is where you have those conversations with. The second piece to that, in relation to the question you just asked, those switch moments, there's not just one. They happen at various points in your life. And for me, there were several turning points. For me, the TYP program was the first switch. I moved to Toronto and became involved in public housing and doing that work, and began to see the disparity in things, what class really meant. Here in Nova Scotia, and then I moved home and realized, how did I survive this racist classes? It was so prevalent when I came home, but because you grew up in it, it becomes part of your reality, and you don't really question it. So we need to talk about the power of conversations within all the struggles, within all the actions that we need to have. And sometimes we need to have a march just for the hell of it, just to show that we're still around. We're still relevant. So we need to pay attention.
I guess I'm speaking as sort of the younger end, I guess. I don't know. I'm a somewhat younger comrade. I don't know anymore. Yes. No, I was going to say that, I guess, two things. From the point of view as an artist speaking, I always remember what Tony K. Bambara said, which is that the job of an artist for the people is to make revolution irresistible. And the way that happens, though, is that I think, you see people up here, you see people doing poetry, and you see sort of the glamorous sides often, you see Rocky speaking, or, so you think I want to be that, or that's what I want to do, but people don't get up. Like, one of my friends actually said to me, we do the emotional work so you can get up and do what you do, like whether that's like before a show when you're like, oh my gosh, you're really pumped to do whatever, right? So there's so many people in your life for anybody. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're sitting there and you're saying, I like to get involved, but I'm not really good at speaking, I don't like speaking, or I don't feel like I don't feel like I can do that. The basic support work, which is what we're talking about with women making sandwiches so that people can go out on the picket line. Friends that you can call up at 3 in the morning and cry about the fact that somebody threatened you because of a poem you did, or friends that are going to hold your hand and get you up there, or clap for you, or support you and tell you what you do is good. Those are revolutionary roles, and they're often the most revolutionary roles because they're the roles that don't come with applause, and they're the roles that don't come with recognition. And every person you see getting recognition has just an army. Like for a woman, you have an army of sisters behind you that are, doing everything for you, so that you're the one that gets in the paper, you're the one that speaks. So that is actually the most revolutionary act, because it comes with humility, it comes with absolutely no expectation of, getting the validation, not getting the power, whatever comes with privilege of these positions. So sitting in the audience today is a revolutionary act as well. You know what I mean? Like, you can't speak if there's no audience to speak back to. So I think people need to remember that as well, that it's not, and now I say this in a long comment, it's not about being the person who's speaking. There's so many other things that go into building those roles. So, and it's also important to focus on that. So yeah.
So I'm wondering if Sherry, Darlene, or if Lynn, if you have any comments you'd like to end us on.
Well, there's so much that you can react, but one of the things I wanted to say is I really so much enjoyed your poem about Mandela, and I want to get a copy of that and send that to a colleague of mine in South Africa that serves the World Forum of Fisher Peoples as the coach here, and we're in our last year. But we share a story. What I wanted to just say is that how a lot of this, even though it happened in the past, is so relevant to now. Because my colleague Nasib Jaffer and I share a common understanding. I always tell him the story about when we won Marshall. I remember Destiny, my daughter, was 9 months old. I was carrying her on my back. We were happy for one day. And this is a minute, and all hell broke loose. And Nasik, who always tells me he spent a year fighting, he spent a year in solitary confinement for fighting anti-apartheid, and with no charge. And you said when they finally won that fight, the anti-apartheid, he recalls a similar experience. We were happy for one day. And unfortunately, what's happened, the people that he fought with in that anti-apartheid fight, now he has to fight. It's almost like a double fight. And that's the same as like with some of our Indigenous leadership. They buy in, it still continues. This colonialism still continues. And about the fishing story, which very relevant today, particularly for the scallop fishermen. And these are just some realities that our work as far from being done. I could just tell you horrific stories of what the scallop fishermen, they end up at the end of the day still owing the captains and so forth. It's horrific. They need to get unionized, and they're scared to speak out. And this is like now. This is like 2013. But what I also wanted to share, there's some of us that have been around the block a few times. We're getting a little bit tired. And I just wanted to share Chris's statements that I was thinking, wow, like because of the younger generation in this room, you give my daughter hope. She does not see, she's blinded to color, she's blinded to sexism, she's blinded to those things. Because, and now if, you know, you raise any issue about homophobia and stuff, she gets really upset. If she has Black Nova Scotian, African Nova Scotian for an uncle and so forth, she gets really upset when you start talking, because it's just, in her mind, it's just not an issue. And just to echo, it's just really nice to see the younger generation in this room, and you give us a little bit of hope, and maybe we, us older folk, can relax a little bit.
Pivotal moment in my life. I won't tell you the story, I'll just tell you the event. It was traveling from Malta to Libya incognito to celebrate Omar Gaddafi's 20th anniversary and to connect with social justice activists around the world and realize that we were a community, a world community. It was a great feeling. But I want to take just 1 second to acknowledge someone that came into the room show, which is Sister Shelley Fashion. If you would stand, she's the person I talked about that busted through the door of the Canada Employment Center.
Darlene, do you have any final thoughts, or shall we proceed?
Give that girl the mic.
when we speak about people who are in the backgrounds, and so that other people can be in the forefront, Shelley, you come to mind. At meetings I go to, there would be Shelley there, she'd be taking the minutes, she'd be doing all the coordination, and I'm thinking, what does she really do? She's everywhere. But that's an example of you have to have different parts. And every part has its place. And no one part is more important than the other part. And when you recognize those things, you can move forward. Because we are all in this together. As one people, as humanity. Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of the conference, and I'd like to thank everybody on this stage for trusting Solidarity Halifax and coming and sharing your stories. You've all been absolutely incredible. I'd like to thank everybody in this room for also trusting Solidarity Halifax and spending the day with us. One of our big challenges and the big questions that we ask ourselves is how do we fight for alternatives to capitalism in the age of austerity? And I think we've learned some lessons from today and from last night. As Tony said, if we go it alone, the boss will laugh in our face. So we can't go it alone. As we heard last night, Rocky went and recruited leaders in every community, in every African Nova Scotian community. So we need to recruit people who are willing to fight oppression. We also realize that we have to be aware of the complexities of our movements. And if we aren't, we'll just keep struggling alone and in isolation. We also have to recognize that our movements aren't free of internal oppression. So when we organize, when we are activists, we have to also realize that we are capable of racism, we are capable of sexism, and we have to be very aware of that and monitor ourselves. We heard from Chris that we need to have fun, and that finding social spaces when we're weird, when we're radical, when we're political is incredibly important. We heard from George last night, never think you have won. While we should celebrate our victories, we can't get lazy, so never think we have won. I'm so happy that Lynn said, you have to act even if your voice shakes. I think that's something that means so much to me, because I lack the bravery so often, but thank you. And thanks to Evan, who made it clear that we are all very ordinary people. But even ordinary people can occupy an office for 122 days. So once again, I would like to extend the invitation to everybody here to fill this form out if you're interested in joining Solidarity Halifax, if you want more information about what we do. I should also promote an event happening later tonight, which is part of the Celebrate the Commons, the 250th anniversary of the Commons. It starts at 7:30. It's at the Halifax Infirmary on Summer Street, and it's a panel with Sylvia Frederici and George Defensis called The Politics and Possibilities for the Commons, Radical Horizons in the Age of Austerity. So please stay for a little while, enjoy the People's Museum. We will be taking it apart in about 20 minutes. And we could actually use, if anybody would like to stay and help us pack up chairs, take things down, we would be very grateful. So once again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to all the committee who put so much work into it. And we'll see you in the struggle.
Thank you to Leslie Thompson for sharing.
Unstoppable!
Why should ever walk across a picket line?